and also
Okay, it's now streaming live. We are now being streamed.
Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to this round. So today debating on government side is Milos and Janko, and on the opposition side, Aisling and Ayal. So the motion for this round reads: given the technology, this house would erase memory and evidence of the criminal past of former convicts after their release from prison. So let's call upon Prime Minister. Here.
Just give me a sec to set up my paper. It's a weird setup on my desk and set up my timer as well. And I'll start in like a minute. Come on. Okay. Timer is set up. Okay. I need to also do this. The notifications are gonna kill me during my speech. Sorry that I didn't do this previously. I didn't know it's gonna be annoying before I started to think about my speech. Okay. Can you hear me, by the way? Yes?
Yes.
Cool. You can see me as well, which is great. Cool. Honorable audience, every criminal, no matter how tough their crime is serving a life sentence. They're serving a life sentence of living a life of stigma, shame, and not properly rehabilitating under the side of the opening opposition. So we're going to do a bit of a charitable and already jump into the comparative of this system, because we do think that opposition and this motion allows oppositions to run a lot of alternatives which fuck us over in many places. So which means that like criminal records in employment, probably we're not going to talk about these sort of situations, but what alternatives can solve probably is the stigma of people around you who possibly know or find out under their side of the house, prejudice of people around you who knew you were in prison because de facto, how do you say, that they have the knowledge and they knew where your life was, and also police to some extent knowing, because like I presume they still want police to know that you did some crime, because they can stop you and do some of these things. So these are the things that we broadly think are the most comparative, even though some teams might be offended because we're not running their arguments from this round. We think this is the most comparative thing that we can run, and other things can be run by alternatives from opening opposition. We ask the opening opposition for a bit of a charitable reading on at least one thing that we think is a bit problematic with the wording so far. So the question, where was my dad for 10 years? I don't know how to answer in this situation if your memory is lost. Let's say he was on a boat. We can have a plausible story or plausible memory why he was there. I hope you are not gonna completely make it even more to a mess of challenging that to some extent. So this is very important for our case a bit later. And also, let's talk about, like, this is not kind of a model. This is more of a, just give me 1 second. Like I'm gonna get to after my model. So some of the things of criminal justice system can still exist under our side of the house. So you can still ban people from working. Punishment can still be ban people from working in specific sectors. So if you did a financial crime, you would still be banned from working in finances and all of these things. Like if you're a sex offender, you're probably not going to be working with children in this situation. So this exists as a punishment. This status quo on top of prison. We think this continues under their side of the house. And second of all, we think that post-prison restraining orders do exist under our under both sides of the house as a form of punishment. So in terms of if you want to go and abuse your victim, I don't think that's going to be allowed under this system either. You're just gonna, like, police is gonna stop you because it's gonna be no. Do you still have a clarification? Do you want to ask me something? Yes.
What will the victim know about what happened to them?
Okay, they know that the crime happened to them. They don't know who did it. That is a particular thing. Yeah, we have to defend it to some extent, sad times. Okay, let's talk about first some principle justification of how do you say why this is principally more just system, and then let's go into the practical of more rehabilitation. Overall, we think that people who did crime, whichever crime it was, it's not necessarily fully their fault. We don't really have full responsibility over our actions because our actions are to some extent fueled by genetics, socioeconomic situations, our parents, our upbringing, people around us, which country we grew up in this situation. So to some extent, people who grew up in a different background, if you grew up in a different background, you might have not committed that crime to begin with. So this is a correlation that cannot be removed, right? And the biggest correlation with crime usually is poverty, right? And to some extent, poverty and is product to some extent of like societal discrimination, distribution of resources, racism, which we're all benefiting from. With like people with privilege are benefiting from like the oppression and horrible situations that most disadvantaged don't have, which pushes them into crime in this situation. We're not saying that no punishment, this concludes that no punishment should ever be given. We just think that punishing them on top of what we already think is the most rehabilitative thing shouldn't happen to some extent. So this should not be a life in prison to some extent, because this is to some extent what you get with stigma and with, prison to prison, situation. So let's talk about how we get better rehabilitation, which is maybe the more important thing. We believe that the biggest correlation, not just getting a job, not just getting all of these things, which to some extent can be mitigated, is also people around you and people who care about you not abandoning you to some extent and having compassion about you. And this is the problem with the current system, with the status quo, without this machine, right? The problem is that people who know that you committed a crime, so your friends, your high school friends, your family, people who cared about you, start distancing from you. Even if they care to some extent, like your mother obviously is still possibly going to care, they still think of you in a different way. They still engage with you in a different way. You still know how they look at you in this sort of situation, which means, and especially, like this is especially true about your friends, right? Which don't have as larger of a bond with you, which means that they can just leave to some extent and not talk to you, right? This means that these people who are convicted criminals are kind of forced into hanging out and engaging with people who are also on the similar level and having similar problems with them. Obviously, we're not saying that all of the time they're just going to continue committing crime, right? But this just means that insofar that rehabilitation is introducing themselves into like normal life and how regular people are operating and like changing this, habits that they inherited, because prison is inherently antisocial kind of place. To some extent, this is something where we can have benefits. Friends, not feeling associated with stigma, not fearing that you are gonna do something like this, and not overblowing what you did. That is huge issue. Like there's an inherent mistrust between your friend and people who care about you, and all of these things. Even if you committed a smaller crime, because they're not sure how you did, and they're also not sure how you turned out after prison, because we have media who is overblowing how prisons look and horrible, like violence and horrible situations. So even if you committed a smaller crime, just the fact that you went to prison means that a lot of friends just don't want to associate with you, don't want to do, which means that to some extent where these people can help you, these people can recommend you for a job, these people can feel compassion for you, these people can talk to you, this is a problem. Also, secondly, notice that these convicts still keep their memories, still keep their memories. This is what they clarified in CH chat, should have possibly been in the motion to some extent, this means that to some extent, criminals who want to talk to their friends about their experiences still have this option. But this option is now much better when they, to some extent, can control this narrative. And when they, to some extent, can, feel that they're not judged prematurely. They can talk what led them to this crime. This is what can lead to catharsis. This is what can lead to compassion, and actually talking through stuff like therapy and like psychologically telling people what happened to you and how you want to change or something. This can happen only if you're getting empathy and impassion from the other side, and not necessarily immediate judgment and feel like you cannot open up to them. So to some extent, that we can have this therapeutic value of friends not abandoning you. This, we believe, is very important from the Gov side. Yeah, this is like, we believe that to some extent they can mitigate our rehabilitation, but still not to the fullest extent. So rehabilitation is still better on our side, which leads to better criminal justice system overall, which we should aspire to vote opening government. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister for their great speech, and now I invite the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Just 1 second. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honestly quite confused about the case we get from opening government at this point in the debate. They're making a huge change to the world. They're making a change that is going to influence the way the criminal justice system works at large. It's going to influence the way society treats underprivileged groups who are more likely to be offended. It influences the way victims are likely to be able to process their trauma. And what they do this for, explicitly from Prime Minister, is in order to achieve the fact that sometimes you will be able to better connect with your friends after you have gone out of prison. They never explain to us, for instance, why you are more likely to be employable. They do not explain to us why you're more likely to integrate with all the circles in your life. We think that even if people have forgotten, when people know that, that we have this policy in place and that criminal pasts are erased, a 1 or 2 year gap within your CV when presenting for a job is still likely to deny you that job. We think that any sort of job that requires any level of trust is still going to be barred to these people. We think that the delta, therefore, that opening government creates with their case is minimal. But let's talk even about that specific part, that where they say you are more able to talk to your friends. We acknowledge that's important. However, we think, first of all, that often these people have family ties that are important, people who are important enough to them to not distance themselves in the same way. We think that during rehabilitation, often what these people do is reach out to friends, to family on the outside, telling them, this is how I've reformed. You are very important to me. I need you in this process, showing them they have become better people. We also think that is part of what makes the rehabilitation process an effective one. All these things can still happen, and we believe it can happen better without this motion. Also, you can just find new friends. You can meet new people who do not know anything about your criminal record, develop friendships with them. We believe they will be better friendships because they're not based on lies and concealment. So even this marginal delta in the OG case, we don't think is the one that actually stands. Notice also that there is, while we acknowledge that criminals do not have a full choice in committing a crime, they have some choice in committing that crime. Why is that important? Because my 2 points are going to be one about why this motion leads to significantly more profiling of minority populations, and the second about the victims and their ability to heal. These groups of people did not make that choice. They made no active choice to have this harm inflicted upon them. We say comparatively, we prefer criminals, people who have chosen to harm others, to have this damage inflicted upon them as opposed to other people. Notice furthermore, and this is important, in terms of rehabilitation, the fact that you have the record erased is if someone assumes you're a criminal, they have no idea what you've been charged for. Meaning you could have been charged for possession of marijuana, you could have been charged for murder or sexual assault. And we think that people tend to assume the worst about you, which means even for the lighter offenders that they want to defend, they actually make the situation so much worse. Let's talk about profiling first. We think that employers have good reasons not to want to hire ex-cons. These are people who have made mistakes in their past, who have been less reliable, and we think there are also a lot of stigma involved in it. When they don't know who is an ex-con, what they're likely to do is go to heuristics, is not hire people with tattoos. It's not hiring people with specific slangs. It's not hiring people from specific ethnicities who are more connected with crime in popular culture. That means people are significantly more likely to become discriminated against. Why is that significantly more likely? Because we are not talking about people who are explicitly racist and do not want to hire, for example, an African American to their place of work. The problem, and we think that people are simply that do not want to operate under these biases. Only a very few people actually do, and people can counter this with facts, with saying, look, this is the life I've led, and I have not done anything that is criminal. Under this world, that option is not available to you. The assumption is made about the worst situation, and we believe that applies to large groups of the population. Yes, there is laws against discrimination, but it's quite hard to say why exactly a person is not being accepted to a job. We believe it's quite easy to still have this level of profiling, and therefore, what we believe this does is it reduces the ability of all people from certain ethnicities to be able to be hired, to be able to sustain themselves, which means also a rise in criminality within these populations. As we said, we believe they are more important than prisoners in the sort of harm done to them. I will now take a POI.
So just to clarify something, would you, in your alternative reality, would you allow employers, would you give them access to public records of convicted criminals? So if I apply in your world, do I know as owner of a restaurant?
Yes.
You would allow them to check?
Yes, we would allow it. Okay, let's talk about, as I said, we already allow people to ask for your CV. That's quite obvious within your CV under your world, that under the world without this proposition that you do have a criminal record. We believe that's something that happens. Let's talk about victims. This motion entails the erasure of evidence. In raising evidence, as opening up government mentioning in response to our clarification, includes who has done this to you, but it also includes other things like what sort of connection you've had with this person in advance, what was the dynamic between you, what exactly happened, meaning parts of your memory of this crime that's been committed against you are fogged, are blurred, are things that you're not able to engage with in the same way. Why is this important? Because it is often for the healing process of people important to have the entire memory of what has happened to them. That is the way in which they can move forward. They can say, I know I take ownership over my own memories. I have certain control over this scene and the situation. We believe what happens if you look at the Me Too movement, for example, we saw women who cared significantly more about sharing what their specific story was than they cared about holding someone, even about holding someone accountable and that person getting their jail time. We believe that sharing your story, sharing a specific dynamic is not impossible within their world. And we believe that is a major harm. We believe that is something not only as a practical harm to people's ability to heal and to heal their trauma through it, but also a principled right that people have over their memories, the traumatic memories that define who they are. We believe that when the state comes in forcefully and takes away part of your consciousness, that is something we cannot stand behind, specifically when it comes to something that is so meaningful for you and a harm that was done to you without your consent. For these reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose the motion. Thank you.
We thank the leader of opposition for their great speech, and now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Okay, so let me start. So when we were preparing our case for side government, we were expecting that the op is going to run something along the lines of that we also will not allow employers to have access to the criminal records of potential employees. And this is why we didn't even think of making such an argument in the prep time, which is obviously a mistake. So now I will try to make such a comparative. So basically what Ayal tells us in terms of employment, which now gives us the whole new area of arguments that we can make in this debate, Ayal tells us that basically this is more or less non-comparative. If you have a gap or two of 2 or 3 years into your in your CV, that means that employers are not gonna employ you anyway. And secondly, that now when people don't know who was convicted for what, people are going to assume that only the worst things have happened. So for instance, you may not be charged for marijuana possession, but rather for, I don't know, mass murder or sexual assault or something like that. So a couple of responses for that. So first of all, 2 or 3 years gap in your CV are usually like not that big of a deal. Many people, and especially many young people, especially those young people who are mostly members of the minorities from unprivileged backgrounds with extremely high crime rate, very often, whether they do go or don't go to prison, they have gap on their CV. This is because the rate of unemployment is very high among the population, where the rate of imprisonment is very high, meaning that most people from the social groups that are going to convicted probably anyway don't have any significant work experience. Second of all, people who are convicted for things such as petty crimes or things such as robberies or crimes against property, which constitutes like 90% of crimes that are committed. Okay, everywhere in the world, over 90% of crimes that are committed are things like theft, robbery, and murder and rape are things that we see mostly on the TV shows, at least in the context of criminal convictions and their rates, right? So usually those people get employed in some pretty mundane jobs, which do not require some vast previous experience. Let's say you work as a waiter, or you work as an apprentice to the mechanic, or such a jobs, right? We don't claim that suddenly people who were convicting of armed robberies are going to be employed at major financial institutions, but we just think that it is important that they get any job in the first place, which in the status quo would be absolutely impossible when you have high demand for those jobs, and it is very clear comparative for your employer that they would not want to risk someone who has been convicted, convicted of the crime, where they can employ someone else who is equally as competent, but that did not commit crime. Furthermore, we tell you, why is this so important? It's important for the reason Milos tells you. Basically, we as a human beings are deprived from free will. There are many more reasons why this would be so, which I don't have time now, the time now to discuss. But anyway, let's say that you are influenced by what your social background was, which means that it would be unfair in their world to discriminate those people in terms of employment, especially because whether you committed crime or not doesn't really have much to do with your moral capacities as a person. There are many people who are extremely immoral and were never convicted of the crime, who may in their world get a job over someone who committed a crime, maybe even out of a necessity, such as being hungry or not having things to put on the table, or stealing golden watch in order to sell it to pay the rent for the family of 6 members who would otherwise be thrown in the streets. We're talking about these kinds of situations. Recognize that most of the crimes are not, exotic and sexy as you see in CSI Miami or other TV shows. These are mostly petty crimes that we are basically talking about. But secondly, the importance of the ability to find employment is important long-term in reducing rates of recidivism and in general rates of crime into society, which are very important metric of this debate, even for Ayal and Aisling, who claim that victims are important, because by reducing recidivism rate, you reduce even the future victims and those traumas not happening, not happening in the first place. Ayal, I'll take your POI now.
Just to be clear, we are fine with doing things like incentivizing employers financially to hire these people. That is something you cannot do on your side of the house when you don't know who these people are and you target them and only get the harms, not this benefit.
Well, I think that you should have said this. I think you should have said in your leader of the opposition. But also, even if you incentivize them, it still doesn't matter, because your cost as an employment to owner of a restaurant is minor. What, you're going to give them $5,000? That is crazy. You don't have even feel to do such a thing. For employer, it's much higher risk to employ someone who has been to prison than it is reward to get tax break on paying taxes for that one employer. It's just not nearly enough of an incentive to achieve the same outcome as we do with erasing collective memory on these things. I want to focus now on the next thing, and this next thing is what Ayal claims about victims, how we own victims the right to have this kind of, to de-traumatize themselves, right? Well, first of all, if parts of your memories are erased and if they're blurry, I'm not sure why Ayala assumes that this is somehow going to be problematic in the context of your trauma. In fact, if you have trauma, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder or any psychological conditions like that, in fact, very often, the less you remember and the more that memory blurs away from you, you feel much, much less of a trauma. So for instance, soldiers who have PTSD from Vietnam have much more severe symptoms 5 years after they return home than 20 years after they return home. Meaning that the way that memory blurs in psychology means that this is just becoming less and less relevant part of our lives. We are not focusing on that nearly as much as we are focusing on other things in life and things like that. The problem with trauma is that you have problems when it is preoccupying your mind, which is usually in the time span that is very close to the point when that traumatic experience has happened. But moreover, this argument is just on the basis of utility less important, because violent crimes make less than 5% of totality of criminals, meaning that on the utility scale, we're dealing with like 95% of criminal cases on our side of the house, whereas they deal on 5 to 10% of criminal cases on their side of the house. So even if their argument is correct, ours is much more important. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their great speech, and now I call the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, so in this speech, I'm going to respond in relation to the argument about employment and also about trauma, and I'm going to talk about prison reform and why that happens better on our side of the house. So starting with employment and profiling. To be clear, the status quo is that people do not want to employ ex-convicts. That is generally accepted to be the case in most states in the world. The response to that, as Ayal raises in a POI and as generally exists, is you do things like introduce financial incentives, you introduce anti-discrimination laws that deal with that, or you have, for example, spent conviction acts. All of those things happen and continue to happen on our side of the house, so that problem continues to be resolved or at least visible on our side of the house. This is a status quo harm that we're able to respond to and can improve on our side of the house. To be clear, Ayal's argument is that when you get rid of the potential for employers to vet for convicts that they're employing, they are more likely to introduce discriminatory measures for ruling out people for particular jobs. This looks like looking at the racial background of someone, using their address to rule out people that you'll employ, using the fact that they have a gap in their CV to rule out the people that you'll employ. It looks like a general increased distrust that could mean that you are employing convicts instead of people who could be employees that you've literally no reason to assume that they could make life more difficult or that they wouldn't be suitable employees. The problem in this case is that, yes, it is regrettable that profiling of convicts happens, but when profiling of innocent people who come from particular backgrounds, as opening government want to stress, who are entirely helpless, that is a significantly greater harm in terms of the impact that can have on people from those communities, and also the likelihood of them having to turn to crime, as opening government wants to stress. Yeah, I'll take a POI on that.
If you are discriminating based on race or any other immutable characteristic, this is not even allowed in the Constitution, let alone any other case. Like, you would go to, like, I don't know, court, possibly to jail if you're doing all of these things. So that's irrelevant.
Okay. Your capacity for you to tell, as Ayal points out, whether an employer has discriminated on you based on race is significantly low unless you're able to bug all their conversations that relate to deciding whether or not they want to employ you. There is no way to definitively define, and it's a problem in most countries in relation to how they introduce anti-discrimination laws, whether they're discriminating on you based on race or whether they're discriminating you based on skill. That is significantly more possible, by the way, to improve when it relates to a convict, because, for example, they might have requested your record, they may have made comments or asked you or other people about your criminal record, which actually means you're more likely to I guess, catch people for discrimination against convicts compared to discrimination against race. So even on that metric, it's more likely that less discrimination occurs based on jobs. The second thing is in relation to trauma. What Janko tells us is that the less you remember, the better you are. Here's what Janko misses. First of all, on their side, the reality is someone else knows. The person who attacked you, the person who put you in danger, the person who changed significantly the circumstances in your life knows that they did that to you and remembers all of the details of that exchange. You have literally no knowledge or awareness of who this person is, whether you could pass them in the street, etc., etc. That means that it's far more difficult to distance yourself from it in terms of how much you process it. The second thing is that the government has made, or to some degree, people in power have basically made this decision for you. You are not able to process this anymore in the interest of criminal justice being more able to happen. And that means that your memory and your access to those memories have been sacrificed. Yeah, maybe Janko's right. Maybe when you shift focus, you're less affected by trauma. But why on earth? That's voluntary shifting of focus. That's the passage of time as you decide to let things go and you process it. That does not happen in this case. Instead, someone else makes the decision for you, and it's significantly more difficult to process. And also, you have significantly less knowledge of the factors, which means that you are thinking more of questions than you are of answers, which means that it takes longer for it to leave your mind long term. Now let's talk about reform. Here's the thing. When you get rid of the impacts that prison has on convicts, it is significantly more difficult to lobby for reform. Often when people lobby for prison reform, so for example, the fact that prisons don't treat people properly, aren't properly funded, are overcrowded, don't have proper resources in places for people to be properly rehabilitated, often the most sympathetic tactic with which to do that is to point to people who are ex-convicts, because in some level, people in society generally accept that once you've done your time, you should be able to move on, right? So you're able to point to the fact that the fact mothers aren't able to visit their children while they're in prison for long amounts of time means that when they leave prison, they're not able to have relationships with to their children and that creates big problems, you have more sympathy from the public than when you just point out that mothers aren't able to see their children in prison. When you are not able to point to the impact of prison on people's lives long-term and on their capacity to live a better quality of life, but also on recidivism rates, you aren't able to lobby for better prison reform because you aren't able to garner sympathy. Let's consider the comparative. Generally speaking, society and candidates tend to be tough on crime and politics. The reasons for this are people who live in backgrounds that tend to be convicted of crimes generally aren't very engaged in the system, generally don't vote, but also statistics show that as people age, they generally favor people being tough on crime and they generally favor being anti-crime. Particularly groups that generally support politicians are more likely to vote and are also more likely to donate to political parties. That means that in general, tough on crime narratives do dominate politics, or at least are very relevant. When society feels out of control because it can't tell what happens to criminals post-crime, so it's not able to tell who the convicts are, who the people who hurt other people are, etc., they are more likely to focus that attention of being tough on crime on prisons. This looks like making prisons worse. So for example, being hesitant to grant parole. In legal systems where you're able to review people's sentences, being hesitant to suspend their sentences or limit their sentences to a smaller amount. But it also looks like less funding, providing less comfort for people, not fixing the system that has a completely overstuffed cells that don't give people any sort of quality of life. It looks like resistance to education programs, resistance in general to rehabilitation programs, addiction programs, etc., because there just isn't a political incentive to put the money there in the first place, let alone to feel sympathetic towards criminals. That means that at that point, prisons become significantly more traumatic for prisoners. That means that if you are a convict, it is likely that you've been mistreated in a more significant amount by both the police who arrest you, the judges who put you in prison, and also the officers in prison. It means that prison becomes a significantly more traumatic place and a more likely place for people to experience extreme trauma. But it also means it becomes more stigmatized. So when Milos tells you, you can just tell your friends you were in prison, if prison is literally the worst place political candidates can possibly make it be, you don't want to tell people you've been in prison. And so all the impacts they tell you about how you're likely to go back and make friends with people who've suffered through the same thing as you are more likely to apply when prisons become worse. This means, firstly, prisons are much more traumatic, which means there's more stigma, you're less likely to tell people who know you, and there's also more distrust issues between the state and ex-convicts. But second of all, you undo the potential for reform. Prisons at the moment, the prison system does not work. It significantly harms communities, especially communities where, for example, whole generations of people are just locked up. It significantly harms families, significantly harms people's capacity to succeed in life. If you want to change any of those systemic issues, you have to reform prisons. You can't on government. Please oppose.
Thank you everyone for this round.